Princess Dyra sat on the edge of her floating balcony, staring at the twin moons of Ivath Prime. The sky was a deep violet, scattered with thousands of stars, but she felt no joy in the beauty of it. She had always felt trapped in her own home, a prisoner of her own body. Unlike the other Ivath, she was born weak. Her species was known across the galaxy for their strength, their warrior nature, their ability to crush entire civilizations under their rule. But Xyra, she was different. Her bones were thinner, her muscles lacked power, and her skin, instead of being thick and armored like her father's, was soft. The court whispered behind her back. The warriors looked at her with pity. She was the daughter of the great King Zervos, but she could never be a true Ivath. Today was supposed to be a special day. It was her birth anniversary, the day the royal family celebrated her existence. But Sarah knew it was just an excuse for her father to remind her of her weakness. And she was right. King Zervos sat on his massive throne in the grand hall, his golden armor gleaming under the glowing crystals that lit the palace. His voice was loud, powerful, as he addressed the nobles and generals gathered before him. "My daughter," he said, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. "She has grown another year, yet she remains delicate." Thyra lowered her eyes as the murmurs began. She clenched her fists. She had heard this speech before. "But I am a merciful father," the king continued. "And so I have decided to grant her a gift. Something rare, something that may amuse her." At his signal, 2 guards entered, dragging a figure between them. He was smaller than the Ivath, his body wrapped in torn fabric, his dark hair matted with dust. He struggled against his captors, but the thick metal cuffs around his wrists held him in place. "A human," the king announced with a smirk. Xyra blinked in surprise. A human. She had heard of them. Weak creatures from a small world called Earth. The Ivath had crushed them in battle years ago. Their warriors had fought bravely, but they had been no match for the Empire's might. Most of them had been wiped out. The few that remained were nothing more than slaves in the farthest corners of Ivath space. "This one is yours, my daughter," the king said, gesturing toward the prisoner. "Perhaps he will entertain you. Humans are fragile creatures, much like yourself." The court laughed. Xyra felt her face grow hot with shame. This was not a gift. This was an insult. The human raised his head, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, she expected to see fear. That was the look most slaves had when they faced the royal family. But this human, he wasn't afraid. "I am Captain Ilias Vance of the Terran Defense Force," he said, his voice firm despite his condition. "I am no one's toy." Gasps filled the room. The guard struck him across the face, forcing him to his knees. "Silence, worm," one of them barked. Xyra's heart pounded. This human was different. He wasn't cowering, even in the face of death. Her father laughed. "See, daughter, even the weakest creatures can have some spirit. Enjoy your gift." With that, the king waved his hand, and the court returned to their celebrations. The guards pulled Elias to his feet and shoved him toward Xyra. She hesitated, then nodded for them to follow her. As they walked through the halls of the palace, she glanced at him. His movements were stiff, but his head remained high. He didn't drag his feet like a beaten slave. "You're not afraid," she observed. Elias turned his gaze to her. "Should I be?" She didn't answer. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. When they reached her private chambers, the guards left, sealing the door behind them. The silence stretched between them. Elias rubbed his wrists where the metal cuffs had bitten into his skin. "If you're going to kill me," he said, "get it over with." Xyra frowned. "Why would I kill you?" "That's what your kind does," he said bitterly. "Or you break us until we wish we were dead." Something about his words made her uncomfortable. She had never thought much about the slaves before. They were simply part of the Empire. But now, standing in front of this human, she felt something strange. Guilt. "I won't harm you," she said at last. Elias studied her for a long moment, then gave a small, humorless chuckle. Then what do you want from me? Zyra didn't know how to answer. She had never wanted anything before. She had always been told what she could and couldn't do, what she was capable of, and what she would never achieve. But as she looked at this defiant human, an idea formed in her mind. I want to learn, she said finally. I want to be strong. Elias raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to help you. She nodded. You fought against my people. You survived longer than most. That means you know things I was never taught. He studied her carefully. And what if I refuse? Zyra hesitated, then said something no Ivath had ever said to a human before. Then you are free to go. Elias stared at her in disbelief. He had expected cruelty, maybe even mockery. But this, he didn't know what to make of it. Finally, he exhaled. Fine, he said. I'll teach you. But understand this. I don't train slaves. If you want my help, you listen. You don't act like a spoiled princess. Zyra smirked for the first time in her life. Then don't treat me like one. At that moment, something changed. Neither of them knew it yet, but history had just been rewritten. The delicate princess and the defiant human, two beings who should have been enemies, had just taken the first step towards something unstoppable. Elias Vance stood with his arms crossed, studying Princess Zyra with cautious curiosity. The alien princess sat across from him in her private chamber, her golden eyes locked onto his, full of determination. She had just asked him to teach her how to be strong. It was an odd request, coming from Ivath. They were known for their strength, crushing planets, dominating the weak, ruling the galaxy with an iron fist. Yet here she was, fragile and unsure, asking the human, one of the so-called weaker species, for guidance. Elias let out a breath. All right, he said at last. You want to be strong. Then tell me, what does strength mean to you? Zyra hesitated. She had grown up in a world where strength was measured by physical power, by the ability to defeat others in combat. But she knew she did not have that kind of strength. Her father had reminded her of it every day. I don't know, she admitted. I only know what I don't want. I don't want to be weak anymore. Elias smirked slightly. That's a start. He stretched his sore muscles, wincing at the bruises left by the Ivath guards. But strength isn't just about fighting. It's about endurance, strategy, knowing when to push forward and when to wait. Zyra leaned forward. Teach me. Elias sighed. He had nothing to gain from this. He was a prisoner, a gift given to a spoiled royal. And yet, there was something different about her, something that made him curious. Fine, he said. But first, get rid of my chains. Zyra hesitated. Letting him go free would be dangerous. If anyone found out, she would be punished. But she had asked for his help, and she could not expect a lesson in strength while keeping him in chains. With a sharp breath, she walked to the control panel and entered a command. A small beep followed, and the cuffs on Elias's wrists clicked open, falling to the floor. He rubbed his skin, rolling his shoulders. Better, he muttered. Then he turned to her. All right, princess. Let's see what you've got. Lesson 1. Endurance. Elias started small. Zyra's body was not built for combat. Not yet. Her bones were lighter, her muscles weaker than the other Ivath. But what she lacked in strength, she had in determination. We start with endurance, Elias said. If you can't last in a fight, you lose before it even begins. He made her run. Not on the smooth, polished floors of her palace, but through the underground corridors, places the nobles never went. The tunnels were uneven, the air thick with dust, but Elias pushed her forward. At first, she struggled. Her legs burned, her lungs ached, but she did not stop. Every time she faltered, Elias would call out, "One more step, princess. One more." She hated how weak she felt. She hated how easily Elias moved, while she struggled just to keep up. But she did not complain. She did not want to be fragile anymore. By the time they returned to her chambers, she was drenched in sweat, her body shaking. But her eyes shone with something new. Pride. Elias smirked. Not bad, princess. You didn't quit. She lifted her chin. I never will. Lesson 2. Fighting smarter. The next lesson was not about brute force. Elias knew Xaira could never match a Yvath warrior in raw strength. But strength wasn't everything. Your people fight with power, he explained. But power without control is useless. He demonstrated human combat techniques, small, efficient movements, ways to dodge and strike with precision. Xaira watched, fascinated. The Yvath fought like storm waves, crashing forward with overwhelming force. But Elias fought like the wind, moving fast, striking where it hurt most, never wasting energy. He taught her balance, footwork, the importance of using an opponent's strength against them. At first, she stumbled, her movements awkward. But Elias was patient. Again, he said every time she failed. Again. And she did. Again and again. Until her body began to remember the movements, until she could react without thinking. One evening, as they sparred, Xaira did something unexpected. She dodged his strike and countered, sweeping his legs out from under him. Elias hit the floor, surprised. Xaira gasped, stepping back. Did I? Elias looked up at her, then laughed. Not bad, princess. For the first time in her life, Xaira felt powerful. Lesson 3. The mind is the strongest weapon. One night, as they sat in her chambers, catching their breath from training, Xaira asked a question that had been on her mind. How do humans resist my father's empire? Elias exhaled slowly. We fought with everything we had. We couldn't match the Yvath in size or strength, so we used strategy. We studied your weaknesses, your habits. We adapted. Xaira frowned. And yet, you lost. Elias's jaw tightened. For now. She studied him. There was no fear in his eyes, no despair, only determination. That is what makes humans dangerous, isn't it? She mused. You don't stop fighting, even when you lose. Elias nodded, because the only battle truly lost is the one you don't fight. Xaira absorbed his words. She had spent her life believing she was weak. But maybe strength wasn't about being born powerful. Maybe it was about refusing to give up. The first test. One evening, during their training, they were interrupted. Princess Xaira. A voice called from outside her chambers. It was her father's general. Xaira's heart pounded. If he saw Elias free, she would be punished. But Elias remained calm. Stay quiet, she whispered, hiding him behind a screen before opening the door. The general frowned at her. Your father has heard rumors that you have been training. His eyes narrowed. He does not approve. Xaira's hands clenched at her sides. She knew what her father thought of her. He would never believe she could be strong. But she was done being afraid. Tell my father, she said, lifting her chin, that I will not stop. The general's expression darkened. He did not argue, but she knew this was only the beginning. As she closed the door, Elias stepped out from the shadows, nodding in approval. You just picked a fight with the most powerful man in the galaxy, he said. Xaira smirked. Then I guess it's time I learn how to win. At that moment, the fragile princess was no more. A fire had been lit inside her, and it would not be extinguished. Xaira stood in front of the tall mirror in her chamber, staring at her reflection. Her muscles still ached from training, and faint bruises marked her skin, but she no longer felt fragile. For the first time in her life, she saw more than just a delicate princess. She saw someone changing, someone stronger. Behind her, Elias leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You ready for today's lesson? Xaira turned to him, her golden eyes filled with determination. Yes. Elias smirked. Good. Because this time, we take it outside. Her heart skipped a beat. Until now, they had only trained in secret, inside her chambers or the hidden corridors of the palace. But Elias knew that real strength wasn't built in safety. It had to be tested. Into the training grounds. The palace training grounds were usually reserved for the strongest warriors of the Yuvath Empire. It was a place of combat, where soldiers proved their worth through brutal duels. Sarah had never set foot there, until now. She kept her head high as she entered, trying to ignore the way the guards and warriors turned to stare at her. Some looked amused, others disgusted. The fragile princess, one of them whispered. What is she doing here? Zara ignored them. Elias walked beside her, calm as ever. I'll be watching, he said in a low voice. Just remember what I taught you. King Zervos' chief combat trainer, a massive Yuvath warrior named Vekran, stepped forward. His dark red armor gleamed under the twin suns, and his arms were thicker than Xyra's entire body. He crossed his arms, looking down at her with a smirk. This must be a joke, he said. The king's delicate daughter wishes to train. I do. Xyra answered firmly. Vekran chuckled, shaking his head. And what will you fight with? Words? Tears? Some of the gathered warriors laughed. Xyra felt her hands clench into fists, but she took a deep breath, steadying herself. I will fight, she said. You can choose my opponent. Vikran's smirk widened. He gestured to a nearby warrior, a young but powerful Yuvath named Corvus. He was a skilled fighter, though not the strongest in the arena. But for Xyra, he would be more than enough of a challenge. Corvus stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. I won't go easy on you, princess, he said, grinning. I don't want you to. Xyra replied. The fight begins. The warriors formed a circle around them, eager to see the weak princess humiliated. Xyra took her stance, her heart pounding. Elias's voice echoed in her mind. Stay light on your feet. Don't try to overpower him. Use his strength against him. Corvus lunged first, moving fast. Xyra barely dodged in time, rolling to the side. The crowd laughed. She's just running. One warrior called out. But Xyra wasn't running. She was watching, studying his movements. Corvus attacked again, swinging his fist toward her. This time, she didn't just dodge. She sidestepped and struck back, hitting his side with a sharp elbow. It wasn't enough to hurt him, but it made him stumble. The laughter faded slightly. Corvus growled, now taking her seriously. He charged forward, aiming to grab her. Xyra reacted instantly, ducking and sweeping her leg under him. He tripped, fell. The warriors gasped. Elias grinned from the sidelines. She's learning. Corvus was back on his feet in seconds, anger flashing in his eyes. He attacked with even more force, but Xyra was faster now. She dodged, weaved, used the techniques Elias had taught her. She struck at weak points. The knee, the ribs, the throat. Her hits weren't as powerful as his, but they were precise. The fight lasted longer than anyone expected. And then, it happened. Corvus swung at her, putting all his strength into the attack. But he had left himself open. Xyra twisted, grabbed his arm, and used his own momentum against him. With a loud TUD, Corvus crashed to the ground. Silence. Xyra stood over him, breathing hard. She had won. The aftermath. The warriors stared, unable to believe what they had just seen. Vekran's smirk was gone. He stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he gave a small nod. You have learned something, princess, he admitted, but strength is proven over time, not in one fight. Xyra didn't argue. She knew this was only the beginning. As she walked away from the arena, Elias fell into step beside her. Not bad, princess, he said with a grin. You just embarrassed a full-blooded Yuvath warrior in front of everyone. Zyra allowed herself a small smile. It's a start. Elias nodded. Yeah, but now you have a bigger problem. She frowned. What do you mean? He glanced around at the watching warriors, some of whom looked impressed, others furious. You just proved you're not weak anymore, Elias said, which means they won't ignore you now. Some will want to challenge you. Others will want to stop you. Zyra's smile faded, but she didn't feel afraid. For the first time in her life, she felt ready. Let them try, she said. Because she wasn't the delicate princess anymore. She was something else, something stronger. And she was just getting started. Zyra stood in her private chamber, staring at her reflection once again. But this time, she saw something different. Not weakness, not fragility, but strength, real strength. Her fight against Corvus had changed everything. The warriors who once laughed at her were now silent. Some watched her with respect, others with suspicion, and some, she knew, were waiting for her to fail. Elias sat on the edge of her balcony, looking up at the dark sky. You realize what's happening, don't you? He said without turning. Zyra glanced at him. They see me as a threat now. Elias nodded. You've made an enemy of the old ways, princess. The Livath Empire doesn't like change. And right now, you're proving that change is possible. Zyra clenched her fists. She wasn't afraid. She had come too far to stop now. But then, the palace alarms rang. A deep, echoing voice followed through the communication system. Princess Zyra, report to the throne hall immediately. It was her father's voice. The alien king had summoned her. Before the king, the throne hall was a massive chamber, its ceiling so high that it disappeared into darkness. Glowing red banners of the Livath Empire hung from the walls. At the far end sat King Zervos, his presence as powerful as ever. His golden armor reflected the dim light, and his piercing eyes locked onto his daughter as she entered. Zyra walked forward with confidence, even as the eyes of high-ranking generals and noble warriors followed her every step. She stopped a few meters away from the throne and knelt. Rise, Zervos commanded. She obeyed, standing tall, refusing to show any fear. The king studied her for a long moment. Then he finally spoke. I have heard troubling reports, he said. Reports that my daughter, the delicate flower of my empire, has been training like a common soldier. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Zyra met his gaze. Yes, father. Zervos' fingers drummed against the armrest of his throne. You embarrassed one of my warriors in combat. I did. And you think this is a good thing. Zyra's heart pounded, but she refused to lower her eyes. I think it proves that strength is not just about size or power. It is about skill, determination, and will. The king was silent for a moment. Then he rose to his feet. His towering form cast a long shadow over her. Strength is control, he said in a low, dangerous voice. It is the power to dominate those who are weak. That is the law of the Livath. Zyra did not flinch. Then what does it mean if a warrior of your empire was defeated by me? The room fell into a tense silence. Some of the nobles' eyes widened at her words. Others whispered amongst themselves. For the first time in her life, Zyra had challenged her father openly. King Zervos took slow, measured steps down from his throne. He stopped in front of her, towering over her smaller frame. His golden eyes burned with intensity. You forget your place, child, he said. You are a princess, not a warrior. You do not fight. You rule. Zyra held her ground. How can I rule if I do not understand strength? Zervos' gaze darkened. You sound like a human. Elias, who stood at the far edge of the room, stiffened but said nothing. Zyra exhaled slowly. Then maybe the humans have something to teach us. Gasps echoed around the hall. Even Elias's eyes widened slightly. King Zervos stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a low, quiet laugh. You truly believe that? He asked. I do, Zyra said without hesitation. Zervos studied her for a long moment before turning away. Then prove it. Zyra blinked. What? The king gestured to one of his generals. Arrange for a combat trial, he ordered. A real fight. If my daughter wishes to prove herself, let her do it before the Empire. Zyra's breath caught. This was not a training match. A combat trial was an official fight, one that was taken seriously. Warriors could be gravely injured. Some did not survive. But she did not back down. I accept, she said. Elias cursed under his breath. Zervos smirked. Very well. The trial will take place in 3 days. You will face a warrior of my choosing. Zyra nodded, her heart pounding. As she turned to leave, Zervos spoke one last time. Be careful, daughter, he said in a calm, almost amused voice. You might not like what real strength looks like. Preparing for the trial. The moment they were out of the throne hall, Elias grabbed Zyra's arm. Are you insane? He hissed. A combat trial is not a simple match. This isn't just about proving a point anymore. Your father will pick someone dangerous. Zyra pulled her arm free. I know. Elias ran a hand through his hair. Then why did you agree? She looked at him, eyes filled with fire. Because if I back down now, I prove him right. I prove that I am weak. Elias sighed. He understood that logic, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. If we're doing this, he muttered, then we need to train harder than ever. Zyra nodded. For the next 3 days, she pushed her body beyond its limits. Elias forced her through brutal endurance training, intense combat drills, and mental exercises. He taught her how to predict an opponent's movements, how to control her breathing, how to fight through pain. And when she collapsed from exhaustion, he simply said, Get up. Your enemy won't wait for you to rest. By the 3rd day, Zyra's body ached like never before, but she had never felt more prepared. Elias studied her with a nod of approval. You're ready, he said. Zyra exhaled. Then let's finish this. Because tomorrow, she would step into the combat arena, and she would show the Empire that she was no longer just the alien king's delicate daughter. She was something more, something unstoppable. The massive combat arena of the Ivath Empire was packed with thousands of spectators. Warriors, nobles, and citizens alike had gathered to witness a fight unlike any other. At the center of it all stood Zyra. She tightened her fists, feeling the rough texture of the battle wraps Elias had tied around her hands. Her heart pounded, but she kept her breathing steady. From the balcony above, King Zervos sat on his throne, watching with an expression of quiet amusement. His golden armor gleamed in the sunlight. Beside Zyra, Elias leaned in slightly and whispered, No matter what happens, don't let them see fear. She nodded. Fear was not an option. A deep voice echoed through the arena. Princess Zyra of the Ivath Empire, step forward. She did. Then, the voice announced her opponent. Vorak, champion of the warfront, step forward. A massive Ivath warrior emerged from the opposite side of the arena. He was taller than Zyra by at least 2 heads, his body covered in battle scars. His armor was minimal, meant for mobility, and his crimson eyes gleamed with confidence. Zyra had expected a challenge, but this was worse than she imagined. Vorak wasn't just a warrior. He was one of the best. Elias cursed under his breath. Your father didn't just pick a strong fighter. He picked a killer. Zyra swallowed but stood her ground. Vorak smirked as he approached. The delicate princess thinks she can fight. He cracked his knuckles. This won't take long. The first strike. A loud Juonji signaled the start of the trial. Vorak moved first, fast. Zyra barely dodged his opening attack, a powerful swing that could have knocked her out instantly. Dust rose from the force of his strike. She countered with a quick hit to his ribs, but it was like striking stone. Vorak didn't even flinch. He grabbed at her, but she rolled away, staying light on her feet. Elias's training echoed in her mind. Use speed. Don't get caught. He's stronger, but you're faster. Vorak lunged again, and this time, Zyra didn't just dodge. She struck back, slamming her elbow into his exposed side. He grunted, but it wasn't enough to slow him down. The crowd roared, some cheering for the princess, others laughing at the idea of her victory. From above, Zervos watched, unreadable. The fight turns. For several minutes, Zyra used speed to avoid being crushed, but Vorak was relentless. Then, he changed tactics. Instead of attacking wildly, he started cutting off her escape routes. Each step, each strike forced her closer to the arena wall. Elias saw the danger immediately. Move. Don't let him trap you. But it was too late. Vorak feinted left, then slammed his knee into her stomach. Zyra gasped as pain exploded through her body. Before she could recover, he grabbed her and threw her across the arena. She hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and her vision blurred for a moment. The crowd erupted. Vorak laughed, standing over her. Is that all, princess? Zyra groaned, pushing herself up. Every part of her body screamed in pain, but she refused to stay down. Elias clenched his fists from the sidelines. Get up, Tyra, he muttered. You can't lose now. Finding strength. Vorak smirked. You should have stayed in the palace, princess. This is no place for someone as fragile as you. Something inside Zyra snapped. She looked up, her golden eyes blazing. Fragile? No, not anymore. With a deep breath, she steadied herself. Elias's training flooded back to her. Pain is not defeat. Pain is information. Use it. Vorak charged again, but this time, Zyra didn't retreat. She moved forward. At the last second, she dodged left, letting his momentum carry him forward. Then, she struck, hard and fast, aiming for the weak spots Elias had drilled into her training. A sharp elbow to the ribs, a kick to the knee joint, a strike to the throat. Vorak staggered. The crowd gasped. Zyra pressed the attack. She ducked under his swinging fist and delivered a brutal punch to his jaw. His head snapped back. For the first time, Vorak looked shocked. The princess was winning. The final move. Vorak roared and lunged one last time, desperate to end the fight. Zyra saw it. She sidestepped at the last second, grabbing his arm and using his own momentum against him. With a sharp twist, she sent Vorak crashing to the ground. A cloud of dust rose. Silence fell over the arena. Zyra stood over him, breathing hard, her entire body aching. But she was still standing. Vorak did not rise. The verdict. For a moment, the arena remained silent. Then the announcement came. Winner, Princess Zyra. The crowd erupted, some in shock, others in cheers. Elias grinned. That's my student. Above, King Zervos watched his daughter with an unreadable expression. Then, slowly, he stood. Impressive, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. It seems my daughter is no longer delicate. Zyra looked up at him, chest heaving. Zervos' eyes glowed. But strength comes with consequences, child. You have challenged the ways of our empire. He turned to the gathered warriors. Tell me, my people, what do we do with those who challenge our traditions? A dangerous murmur ran through the crowd. Elias's smile faded. This isn't over, he muttered. Zyra clenched her fists. She had won the battle. But the real fight was only beginning. Zyra stood in the center of the combat arena, her body aching from the fight. Sweat dripped from her forehead. Her breathing was heavy, but she was victorious. Vorak, the great warrior of the Uavath Empire, lay defeated at her feet. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered, others whispered in shock, but many, especially the noble warriors, glared at her with anger. Above, on the royal balcony, King Zervos watched her with a strange, unreadable expression. His golden armor gleamed under the bright lights. He had always called her weak. He had always believed she was nothing more than a fragile princess. But now she had proven him wrong. Zyra wiped the blood from her lip and looked up at her father. For a moment, there was silence. Then Zervos raised his hand. The crowd immediately quieted. The king's deep voice echoed through the arena. "My daughter has won." A few cheers rose, but they quickly died down as he continued. "But strength is not measured by a single battle." He stepped forward, his piercing gaze locking onto Zyra. "Strength is tested over time, and those who challenge the laws of the Empire must be ready for the consequences." Zyra's stomach tightened. She knew her father too well. He would not let this go so easily. Zervos turned to the nobles and warriors gathered around. "Tell me, my people, do you accept a future where a human's training has made a Yvath princess stronger than our greatest warriors?" A wave of anger rippled through the crowd. Some shouted in protest. Others clenched their fists. One warrior stepped forward. It was General Kale, one of the king's most loyal commanders. His red eyes blazed with fury. "This is an insult to our traditions. A princess should not fight, and she should not be trained by a human." A chorus of agreement followed. Zyra's fists tightened. Elias, who stood just outside the arena, muttered under his breath, "This is bad. A dangerous decision." The king turned back to Zyra, his expression hard. "You have forced me into a difficult position, daughter." Zyra lifted her chin, refusing to show fear. "I only proved what you always taught me, father," she said. "Strength rules, and I am strong." Zervos studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. But it was not a warm smile. It was cold, calculating. "Very well," he said. "You wish to be strong. Then you shall have your chance." He gestured to his guards. "Take the human." Zyra's eyes widened. "What?" Before Elias could react, two heavily armed warriors grabbed him. He struggled, but they held him tight. "Let go of me," Elias growled. Zyra rushed forward, but another guard blocked her path. She turned to her father, fury burning in her chest. "This isn't right." Zervos' expression remained calm. "If you wish to fight like a warrior, then you must suffer like one. A warrior's strength is not just tested in combat, it is tested in loss." Zyra's breath caught. Zervos looked at Elias. "This human has made you stronger, but now we will see what happens when he is taken away." The guards started dragging Elias away. "Zyra," he shouted, "don't let them break you." She clenched her fists so hard her nails dug into her skin. Her father watched her closely. "Prove your strength, daughter. If you are truly worthy, you will find a way to survive without him." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The trial was over. But a new battle had just begun. A new prisoner. Elias was taken deep into the palace dungeons, locked in a dark cell. The walls were cold, the air thick with silence. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, exhaling slowly. "All right," he muttered. "Guess we're playing this game now." He wasn't worried about himself. He had been in worse situations before. But he was worried about Zyra. She had just begun to find her strength. But would she be able to stand against the entire empire alone? He closed his eyes. "You better not give up, princess." The silent rebellion. Back in her chambers, Zyra paced back and forth. Her mind raced. Her father had made his move. Now it was her turn. She could not challenge him directly. Not yet. But she would get Elias back. She needed allies. She needed a plan. And most of all, she needed to prove to the Empire that strength was not just about brute force. She turned toward the balcony, looking out over the sprawling city. For years, she had been seen as weak. Now she had shown them something different, and that had made her dangerous. But her father had made a mistake. By taking Elias, he had only fueled the fire inside her. She would not let this stand. She would fight. And this time, She would not stop until she had changed the empire forever. Cyrus stood on her balcony, overlooking the massive city of the Yevath Empire. The golden towers shone under the twin suns, but tonight the city felt different. The air was heavy with tension. Her father thought he had won. He thought that by taking Elias, he could break her spirit. But he had only made her stronger. She turned away from the view and faced the small group of figures waiting in her chambers. These were not nobles or warriors loyal to the king. They were outcasts, fighters, and those who had been cast aside by the empire's strict traditions. Among them was Corin, a former Ivath soldier who had lost his rank for questioning the empire's ways. His arms were crossed, his crimson eyes sharp. Beside him stood Vela, a skilled pilot who had been exiled for refusing to follow orders that would have harmed innocent civilians. They were not many, but they were enough. Zyra took a deep breath. Elias is in the palace dungeons. My father wants to use his capture to prove that strength only belongs to those who follow the Empire's rules. Her voice was steady. We're going to prove him wrong. Corin raised an eyebrow. You plan to break into the most heavily guarded part of the palace. Yes. Vela smirked. I like this plan. The heist begins. Late that night, under the cover of darkness, Zyra and her group moved through the lower levels of the palace. She wore a dark cloak, her golden armor hidden beneath. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. Corin led the way, using his knowledge of the palace's security to avoid the patrols. Vela carried a small device that disabled surveillance for short periods. They slipped past guards, moving quickly and silently. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. The dungeons were not a place of comfort. They were a place of punishment. Finally, they reached the massive doors leading to the prison cells. 2 guards stood watch, their weapons glowing faintly in the dark. Lyra signaled to Corin. He moved fast, taking one down with a precise hit to the neck. The second guard barely had time to react before Vela struck, knocking him unconscious. Zyra grabbed the key from the guard's belt and rushed inside. Reunion in chains. Elias sat on the cold stone floor of his cell, humming softly to himself. He had no way of knowing how much time had passed, but he knew one thing for sure. Kyra would come for him. He heard footsteps and looked up just as the door swung open. Zyra stood there, her golden eyes fierce. Took you long enough, he said, grinning. Zyra rolled her eyes and tossed him a small knife to cut the energy cuffs around his wrists. We don't have time for jokes, she said. We need to move. Elias stood, rubbing his wrists. Lead the way, princess. But as they turned to leave, a deep voice echoed through the chamber. I knew you would come. Zyra froze. From the shadows, King Zervos stepped forward, his golden armor gleaming even in the dim light. Behind him, a squad of elite warriors blocked the exit. Father versus daughter. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the king sighed. You are more foolish than I thought, Zyra. She clenched her fists. I am doing what you have always told me to do, father. I am proving my strength. Zervos shook his head. Strength is not rebellion. Strength is order. You are throwing away everything for a human. Zyra stepped forward. Elias is not just a human. He is my friend. And he has shown me something you never did. That strength is not just about power. It's about choice. Zervos' expression darkened. Then you have chosen your fate. He raised his hand. The warriors moved forward. Zyra's pulse raced. They were outnumbered, but she was not afraid. The final battle. Corin and Vela leaped into action, taking on the nearest warriors. Elias ducked a swinging blade and tackled one of the guards. Zyra faced her father. Zervos drew his blade. Show me what you have learned. Zyra took a deep breath and attacked. Their weapons clashed, sparks flying. Zervos was powerful, but Zyra was faster. She dodged his heavy strikes, looking for an opening. He swung down hard, and she sidestepped, slamming her elbow into his ribs. He barely flinched. He grabbed her wrist and threw her back. She hit the ground but rolled to her feet. Elias was still fighting nearby. Corin had taken down 2 guards but was struggling. They were running out of time. Zara had to end this. She took a deep breath and focused. When Zervos lunged again, she didn't dodge. Instead, she moved forward, using his own momentum against him. She twisted, sweeping his leg out from under him. For the first time, the king stumbled. Zara pressed the attack. A quick strike to his wrist knocked his weapon away. She followed with a kick to his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. The chamber fell silent. Zervos looked up at his daughter, his expression unreadable. She pointed her blade at him. "The old ways are breaking, father. I will not let this empire crush those who are different." For the first time, Zervos said nothing. Then he laughed, a deep, amused laugh. "Perhaps I have underestimated you." Tidra narrowed her eyes. "You're letting us go." He smirked. "For now. A new beginning." Tyra, Elias, and their allies escaped into the night. As they reached the outskirts of the city, Elias turned to Zyra. "So, what now?" Zyra looked back at the towering palace. "Now we build something new." Elias grinned. "A rebellion." Zyra smirked. "A future." And with that, they disappeared into the darkness, ready to change the empire forever.